All right, what's good, y'all? I was too lazy to record an introduction, so here we are in voiceover mode. Yeah, so if you have a V6 Solara or Camry, this is your how-to for replacing the clutch, the flywheel, rear main seal, whole 9 yards without using the lift or pulling the subframe / pulling the engine and transmission assembly out. Here we go. So this is everything that I use to complete this job. I have some wood planks cut up. You can get those at Home Depot real cheap. Got a transmission jack. Obviously a floor jack. You're gonna need 2 jack stands with it, at least. Got a drain pan, got some brake fluid. Impacts are optional, but they help quite a bit. A couple ratchet straps. I got my seal puller for the rear main seal. A couple different channel locks. A couple hammers. I have a pickle fork here, but you can use a pry bar, a crowbar, anything along that line. It just needs to have something that's wedged at the end. I use this 1/2-inch drive ratchet to manipulate the transmission jack. This is a must-have. If you don't have a swivel head, 3/8 drive from Harbor Freight, you need to go get one. A couple different extensions, both 3/8 and 1/2-inch drive. I got my 1/4-inch ratchet, got a U-joint, couple step up, step down adapters, 14 and 10 mil combo wrench. I got a 10 mil line wrench. This is very important. It's for the clutch line. Got a set of needle nose pliers, 1/4-inch and 1/2-inch drive torque wrenches. Then I have an assortment of sockets. If you see doubles like the 12s here, it's because I have both the 3/8 and the 1/4-inch drive that I used. This 11/16 socket is very important. Got my 30 mil for the axle, 24 for the drain plug. Your 22 is going to be for the crank pulley bolt. Your 18 is going to be for the ball joints. You may have 17s, you may have 19s down there. It just depends on what brand you have. Also, you're going to need like a Phillips head, flathead. I also use some compressed air in this process, you'll see. Also, get yourself some of this grease. Okay, so the very first thing we're gonna do is get the car up on jack stands and get the wheels off. I'm using an impact. So if you're using hand tools, breaker bars, whatever, it would be very wise to pop off the center cap and go ahead and knock loose the axle nuts. When you get the car on jack stands, the next thing you're gonna do is drain the transmission. At this point, if you had a stock intake, it'd be wise to take the intake off now. But the reason that you would take it off is to access the fill plug on the transmission. This fill plug is right next to the starter. The way I normally get the fill plug off is I just throw a bunch of extensions together and I use my swivel head. It's usually very tight, so if you're not careful, you can easily bust a knuckle. Make sure when you're doing this job that you replace the crush washer. Does that mean I replace them every time? It's up for debate. Okay, now we're under the car. It can be found almost directly under the driver's side axle. This is the one that you have to be very careful with because depending on the tools you're using, it's very easy to strip this bolt. You can already see that I have been here before. This is a really important part because you want to make sure that you are perfectly square on this drain bolt. If you are off by even a little bit, it is going to round off the drain bolt and you are going to need to extract it. So once you're square on the drain bolt, you're just going to push on it and it should be loose. Now, in my experience, this stuff comes out pretty fast, so I like to regulate the flow of gear oil coming out of the transmission for like 2 or 3 minutes. That way I don't flood my garage with gear oil. I've done it before, it's not fun. Just to give an example of how much it'll flow. Yeah, no. We're gonna get to the ball joints, the tie rod ends, and the axles. You're gonna be dealing with 2 cotter pins on each side. There should be a cotter pin in the tie rod end and a cotter pin on the end of the axle. Depending on the condition of the cotter pin, it should be pretty easy to take out, but cotter pins and I don't really get along that well most of the time, so experiences vary. Now, the one common thing about the Solaras is the axle nut. It's always going to be a 30 mil. Typically, the castle nut on the tie rod ends is going to be an 18 mil, but it'll vary depending on the ball joint that you have. But typically, the bolt is going to be an 18, and the nuts will be a 19. But it just depends on the brand, so you kind of have to size that out. You're gonna start by reverse threading the castle nut back onto the tie rod end. This is a very important step, because if you don't do this, you're gonna mushroom it. It's gonna be ruined. You're gonna need a new tie rod in. All the way until the bottom is flush with the stud. You're gonna grab Old Reliable, and instead of immediately hitting on the stud, you're gonna hit the hub. This breaks loose all the rust. So right there is about where you're gonna hit. You're gonna get a few good hits in, and then you're gonna immediately transfer to the stud. And it should pop right out. Once you get the castle nut back off, you're gonna move your tie rod out of the way. And you're gonna go to your axle nut, throw that 30 mil on there. Take it off. So at this point, you're gonna take your pickle fork or a crowbar or something. You can even use your hands. I would prefer to use pickle fork. And that's when you'll go in and separate the control arm from the ball joint. At this point, you can push the axle out of the hub, grab it, get positive control, move it out of the way, turn your hub, and let it rest back. Now, for the passenger side, there will be a clip on the carrier assembly. Directly underneath is a 14 millimeter bolt that retains it in the housing. This is only on the passenger side. Removing it is very easy. It's a little harder to do one-handed, but you just get a needle nose on there. And it may take a couple tries when you're doing it with one hand. But you're just gonna squeeze and pull, and it'll be out of the housing. Removing the bolt is pretty self-explanatory. If you plan on reusing the axle seals, you need to be very careful removing the axle. If you're too rough, you can nick that seal, and all this will be for nothing because you'll have a leak and you'll have to do it all over again. These cars can be a huge pain in the ass when it comes to removing axles, both on the driver and passenger side. Now this car doesn't give me any issues. The reason mine has been so easy is because this is now the third time that I've had this axle out, and I've maybe driven the car 1,000 miles. What I like to do to get it out is go from underneath the car and put a crowbar, something that's gonna be able to grab onto this end from underneath the car. So here's the transmission, the exhaust is running through here. We're looking at the axle carrier right now, and we have access to the axle itself. You angle your crowbar against this piece here. You take a sledge and you tap it out. You don't yank the axle out. You don't beat the hell out of it. Because like I said earlier, your splines can 1000% nick that seal. So we're gonna repeat the process with the ball joint and tie rod in on the driver's side and get the other axle out and move on to the next step. I like to keep the driver's side axle in, but this job can be 1,000 times easier if you just remove the axle. I'm so used to doing it this way at this point that I just leave the axle in. Next step, you will be moving these two 10 mils. So I guess I didn't record this part, but you're also gonna wanna take off the skid plate. It's a big metal plate. It goes on the front of the car, right underneath the radiator between the subframe and the front bumper, and it's held on with like 6 10 mils. You're gonna go ahead and take that off too. And with your skid plate and everything else removed, now's a good time to throw that drain bolt back on the transmission. So at this point in your repair, you're gonna remove the battery. I always like to think positive first. You're obviously gonna be careful removing the leads on your battery. And even when you do remove them, there's still a chance that they hold a charge. So just be careful. There's a little tab on the fuse box here. Just pull that up. It'll remove it from the bracket. And then I like to take the battery tie down and the battery out of the car. It just gives you a little bit more room to work. Next, go ahead and unplug this connector from the starter. It can be a little tricky to get to if you're doing this with one hand, like I am. Bolts on the starter are 14 mil. They're relatively easy to get to. Just get an extension, deep well, and you're in there. For the one up front, I just get a short socket. Now at this point, you can just pull the starter off. Now, if you want to go through the trouble of taking off the lead wire to the starter, you can do that. I personally don't. I just set it where the battery goes. Next, I like to remove this ground. Unplug your reverse switch. Move the tab on the engine harness away from the bracket. Get the engine harness off the transmission. Once you get your reverse switch unplugged, you're going to follow your wiring harness back down to the back side of the transmission. Locate your speed sensor. You're going to unplug that speed sensor. Next thing I like to do, since I'm here, is remove the shift linkage. You can use a needle nose to get to these pins. I just do it by hand. They're relatively easy to take off. Just make sure you don't lose them. And be very careful with this one because you don't want to lose the washer. At this point in the repair, it'd be wise to mark your shift linkage. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory where it goes, but it is possible to mix it up. It won't be the worst thing in the world to mix them up. It takes like 5 seconds to figure out that you have them backwards, but I like to mark mine. Now to get the shift linkage off the transmission completely, I like to take channel locks and flip them upside down and grab these retaining tabs off of the shift linkage. It can be a pain, but with a little finesse, I went and got a bigger set. I'm gonna do the other one off camera. It's a little bit harder to get to. When you get the retaining clip off, you literally just wiggle a little bit. You'll be able to push the shift linkage back and rest it off to the side. You're gonna take a line wrench. You're not gonna take a regular open-in combo wrench. You're gonna take a line wrench and crack loose this fitting for your clutch line. And you're only gonna crack it loose. You're not gonna take it all the way out yet. So at this point, you get a rag or something under there. You can go ahead and unscrew it all the way. And then you'll carefully do the same method you used for the shift linkage to get that retaining clip off of the clutch line. And you'll remove the clutch line from the transmission. Now, even though I have the hose clamped, I like to try and keep it as high as possible because that clamp is not perfect. And I don't want to spill hydraulic fluid everywhere. Next, you're gonna go ahead and remove these two 14mm bolts. This will be important later. So next, you're gonna get under the car and remove the two 14mm bolts holding the front engine mount down. Now, if you don't have a swivel head ratchet, you can go to Harbor Freight and spend $10. This thing is amazing. But you'll just break it loose. And so once you have the bolts off, you don't need to pull the mount incredibly far back, just enough to separate itself from the transmission. Next, you're gonna remove these caps. There's two of them. There's one here and another one here. And you will find the 14mm nuts holding down the lower end of the transmission mount. Just get a deep well socket on, and you'll be able to crack it loose. And then the next thing you're gonna do is get the three 14mm bolts from your main front engine mount. You're gonna crack those loose, and then you'll be able to just go ahead and zip them out. The swivel head ratchet, it'll fit. It'll be a little awkward, but it'll work. You're gonna need a U-joint. Get creative with some extensions to get around the exhaust manifold. You're gonna get your 17mm socket. You're gonna go ahead and zip the top bolt off after you get the bottom three off of the mount. You Finally got that last bolt out. The only two things that are still secure are the dog bone and the axle carrier / lower engine mount in the back. So from this point forward, you should be very careful with what you're doing. I suggest removing the strut bar if you have one, because we are going to be hoisting the engine up. In my case, we're going to be jacking the engine up. And it's very easy to screw up your EGR. It looks like you have a lot of room in there, but you'll see here soon that this EGR is going to get very close to this strut bar. So if this is your first time doing it or you're nervous, it takes maybe 2 seconds to take the strut bar off. Now, it'll probably be a lot safer for both the components on your engine and you if you use a cherry picker and like an engine hoist of some sort that will brace against the fenders and suspend your engine from the engine bay. But I'm gonna be using my 3-ton with a little slab of wood. Now this next part might start some arguments, but this is the way I've been doing it. As long as you're careful, you won't put a dent in your oil pan. Now, I know there's a dent in the oil pan on this one, but this is not from me doing this job. But I like to get that little piece of wood, nice and flat, really as far forward as you can get it without it being too far over that lip. And you just slowly apply pressure with that jack. And it's going to slowly come up. And what this is doing is relieving pressure off of your front engine mount. You get it up high enough, you will be able to slide this engine mount out from its little house, out from underneath the housing. It's gonna be a little tricky, but it'll come out. Now at this point, you either need to keep tension on the engine hoist or leave your engine in jack jail, because if you lower this right now all the way, you're gonna screw something up. But what I like to do, which I had to do off camera because it took 2 hands, is lower it back down to where it would be if the engine mount was still in. Next, you're gonna go ahead and grab your transmission jack. Now, if you don't have these pieces of wood or a block of some sort to support the weight of the transmission, you're probably going to have to drop the merge pipe on your exhaust. Now, your transmission jack may be different, but mine, the straps don't reach. So I usually run a ratchet strap of my own. I'm just making sure that I'm not pinching any lines or strapping anything down to the transmission that doesn't need to be strapped down. I've flipped the orientation of my trans jack, and that is because I needed to get the adjustments on this side to match the angle of the housing of the transmission. It's very important that you match that very specific angle before you separate the engine and transmission, because if you don't do that step, it is going to be a nightmare trying to make the transmission back to the engine. At this point, with the transmission jack braced as tight as it can be against the transmission, you can go ahead and relieve pressure. I had to do it off camera again because it does take 2 hands. This is going to allow you to use the transmission jack to get the transmission mount out of its spot. So the next thing you're going to do is jack the transmission up. So you see I've got it jacked up just enough. There's a gap in between the mount. When you're removing those bolts, if you feel things start to shift, that means you need to put more weight on the transmission jack. Raise it up just a little bit higher. At this point, your transmission mount will be totally free of the transmission. I need to raise the transmission jack like maybe 1/4 of an inch, not even, and this will come out. There's just a couple bolts back here that you got to remove. You got 2 10mm bolts right here. And then you'll have to remove 3 14mm bolts. So for this specific 14 mil, if you leave the exhaust on, it's gonna kind of suck to get it off, but all you gotta do is use a wrench, and then you can put the box end of another wrench on top. You slip it through like that, and then you got yourself an extended wrench, and you'll be able to break it loose. This bolt that's sticking out, oh, hello. This bolt that's sticking out here is the one you are going to unscrew. It's not going to be the one that's recessed underneath the axle seal. And just make sure you're careful, because you see they are different sizes, different lengths. So just make sure you're paying attention to what went where. Once you finish removing those 14mm bolts, you're going to put the jack back where it went. Now that you got the 14 mils from underneath and your engine is nice and supported, you got about 4 bolts left, 4 or 5. There's 2 of them here by the shift linkage. These are 17 mils. And you got one next to the starter. You got one just above the slave, and then you got another just below where the engine mount up front supports the engine and transmission. You're gonna use a combination of a short socket, deep well, get yourself like a 6-inch extension, and these will come out no problem. So when you're separating the transmission with it still in the car, you want to aim to get it between the subframe and this part of the body. You can maybe make it easier for yourself by bending this tab out of the way. There's also a bit of a risk, you know, bend this too many times, it's going to come off. You're going to use a jack or your hoist or your cherry picker, whatever you got supporting the engine, and you're going to use the transmission jack. When it's ready to go through that little clearance hole or whatever, you're going to have the entire assembly sitting like this, and it's going to push out this way. So at this point, I'm a lot closer to that point of being able to slip through, but I'm also kind of taking the engine with me. So I'm going to go ahead and start trying to separate the transmission from the engine. Came in with my fork, braced it against this stud here, just very lightly. Separated it enough to see the pins that hold it on. That's how I know I'm in there. So at this point, I'm probably going to get in with my bare hands, grab the transmission, and pull it off. Transmission's off. And now you got to play with the jack, get things even. That way you can pull it straight back. Because right now, the input shaft is definitely pinned against, not pinned, but it's resting against the... So I messed my words up right here. What I was trying to say is the input shaft was resting against the forks on the pressure plate. And, you know, it's not a terrible thing. It's not like it slammed against it. But if you were to pull things apart right now, there's a chance that the weight would shift too much and, you know, you might break something and be suboptimal at best. So, yeah, that's why I was saying to get things even. Oh, and see, that's why you don't put your hand where it shouldn't be, because that's not supposed to happen, but accidents do happen. But now I have the transmission in the spot where I want it to replace my clutch. You have access mainly from the top. What I like to do is come from underneath and work from here, but you have access to the bolts you need to remove. Take the clutch off. Once the clutch is off, you got a nice little view of the throb bearing, the fork. You can do quite a bit of work under here. And this is what you're gonna be looking like on the driver's side. Now, here's that tab I was talking about. If this tab was bent up, I could probably pull this transmission just a little bit further out. And in this case, since I'm replacing the flywheel, I think that's what I'm gonna do. So with that tab bent up, it gave me like another inch or so of clearance. And honestly, you get a good enough view of everything, especially once you get the clutch off, you know? So what I like to do to keep everything still while I'm wrenching, because this engine will turn over while you're trying to loosen or tighten anything. I like to take one of the 14mm bolts that was holding the transmission to the engine on the bottom and put it between this pin and a tooth on the ring gear. So once you have everything braced, you can start attacking the clutch bolts. They're 12mm bolts, and it shouldn't take a whole lot to get them loose. And with those bolts, you should loosen one, get it a few threads, then turn the engine over, loosen another, and then go through until they're all loosened, and kind of do it evenly, because you are going to be fighting the spring pressure of the pressure plate. Turning the engine over is very easy. All you gotta do, take off this cover and make sure we don't lose these. Take your cover off. You're gonna grab a 22mm socket. And I like to use my swivel head for this, but I rotate clockwise. If you have the transmission split far enough apart, you really won't have to rotate in between pressure plate bolts, but when you are rotating, rotate clockwise. It's gonna come straight off, and you're gonna put the phone down and use two hands to catch that clutch disc so it doesn't hit the ground, but you get the idea. So breaking off the flywheel bolts isn't really terrible, but I would not use anything that ratchets in order to break them off. I definitely recommend using a breaker bar for this part. And that'll be number 8. So once I know I got all of them out, I'll go through, just thread one back in just a little bit, and I'll get my pickle fork and just pry it off. And she should be good to go. So this is a very important part of the job, okay? The throwout bearing will make or break your entire job. I've been defeated by this thing twice now, as you all know. Now, if you have a factory one in and it wasn't making noise before, and it doesn't make noise if you go through and spin it, it's my advice to just leave it alone. Leave it alone. Don't replace it, because a lot of these clutch kits nowadays, they're going to send you a shitty one. If you need to replace the throwout bearing, if you absolutely cannot reuse the old one, buy OEM. Get an OEM throwout bearing. I don't care how much it costs. Go get the OEM one. Now, to uninstall the throwout bearing for this video, because I don't need to replace it, I'm not going to take it off. But literally all you do is just pop off the clip, and it comes right off of the input shaft. Reinstalling is the same way. Just make sure, absolutely sure, that the retaining clip snaps in to the fork. So at this point in the process, we're gonna go ahead and replace the rear main. It's something that isn't incredibly hard to do. You just have to be careful, especially with limited room to work. This is a lot easier to do with, nothing in front of it, but it is still possible from this angle, and I'll show you how. So the very first thing I did was brake clean the area. For the stuff you can't get to, it pays to have picks. You can go through and scrape everything out with the pick. So getting the seal is not really an insane task. You just have to be careful not to mar up the mating surface. So you can take one of these tools and go on the inside of the seal here. You see where this little rubber piece is, that's soft, right? So you can stick that in between and make sure you're putting force on the seal side and not on the mating surface where the seal actually does its job. You just got to put a little bit of force. It's kind of hard to crank it because the transmission's in the way, but while being very careful, it is possible. And I'm pushing straight down on this. I am up against the crank, but this is about the only way to do this part. From here, I'm just being careful. I'm not really putting a ton of force into it. Once I lose leverage, just go underneath, rotate out. The new rear main is freshly lubed up with oil. We're gonna go ahead and do the same to the inside sealing surface as well. So you wanna get this surface and the inside lubricated with fresh engine oil. Now this is kind of a two-handed job, so I'll just kind of explain what I'm gonna do. But essentially you're just gonna get that seal in there. You're gonna lay something flat across and you're going to lightly tap it in. It's as easy as that. Another way you can do this is tap in one end of it and then lightly start feeding it in around here. I don't think it's gonna go on perfectly straight unless you have the tool to do it, which I don't. But the biggest thing is making sure that it is flush and even all around. And the last thing that I'll do before putting the flywheel back on is blowing out the holes. Get some compressed air.